The phone call came at 1:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday. When you spend your entire life playing the role of the designated crisis manager for a family that actively despises your independence, you learn to dread the sound of a ringing phone in the dead of night. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. The sharp, frantic vibration echoing against my mahogany nightstand carried the unmistakable urgency of my mother's panic. I let it ring 3 times. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself before answering. "Get to the house," my mother's voice snapped through the speaker the second I picked up. There was no hello, no apology for waking me, no inquiry about how my week had been. "Your father is having a minor episode. Spencer is in trouble. We need you in the study. Now." She hung up before I could utter a single syllable. I sat up in the dark, the cool silk of my sheets a stark contrast to the familiar, suffocating heat of family obligation rising in my chest. I am 34 years old. I am a senior partner at one of Manhattan's most ruthless corporate restructuring firms, holding a dual master's degree in organizational psychology and corporate finance. I am Audrey Hayes. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. I didn't rush. I took my time getting dressed, pulling on a tailored charcoal gray cashmere turtleneck and dark slacks, armor for the battlefield I was about to walk into. I drove the 45 minutes out to my parents' sprawling, heavily mortgaged Connecticut estate with the radio turned off, letting the rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers serve as my only companion. For 34 years, the dynamic in the Hayes household had been set in immovable stone. My father, Robert, a 62-year-old man who viewed himself as a titan of industry, was the reigning monarch. My mother, Susan, at 60, was his loyal enforcer and a masterclass in psychological manipulation. And then there was my younger brother, Spencer. 31 years old, devastatingly handsome, perpetually charming, and entirely, catastrophically incompetent. Spencer was the golden child, the undisputed heir to Hayes Logistics, the mid-sized supply chain empire my father had built from the ground up. Growing up, my achievements were always treated as baseline expectations, while Spencer's mere existence was a cause for grand celebration. I took out staggering student loans to fund my Ivy League education. Spencer was gifted a brand new Mercedes for barely graduating from a mediocre state college with a degree in communications. When I finally pushed open the heavy oak doors to my father's private study, the air was thick, smelling of aged scotch, expensive leather, and unmitigated raw panic. My father was pacing violently behind his massive desk, his face flushed an angry, mottled red. My mother sat on the edge of a tufted leather sofa, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, a theatrical performance she reserved for whenever she needed to play the victim. And then there was Spencer. He was slouched in a wingback chair, nursing a crystal glass of my father's most expensive whiskey. He didn't look like a man whose world was falling apart. He looked mildly inconvenienced, like a teenager waiting for his parents to finish lecturing him about a dented bumper. "It's about time," my father barked, stopping his pacing to glare at me as if my 45-minute drive in a torrential downpour was a deliberate personal insult. He picked up a thick leather-bound financial ledger and hurled it across the room. It slammed onto the coffee table in front of me with a violent crack. "Look at it! Just look at what your brother has allowed to happen under his watch." I didn't flinch. I calmly picked up the ledger, opening to the bookmarked page. I scanned the columns, my trained eyes easily cutting through the chaotic accounting. My stomach tightened, though I kept my expression entirely neutral. $2 million. Exactly $2 million in liquid operating capital had simply vanished from the primary corporate accounts over the last quarter. "A minor cash flow issue," Spencer muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. The European markets have been volatile. I authorized a few aggressive expansion strategies. High risk, high reward. It just hasn't yielded the return yet. It's standard business friction. "Standard business friction?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, the cold precision of my tone cutting through his arrogant delusion. "You are the vice president of operations, Spencer. This isn't a misplaced decimal point. This is a gaping $2 million crater in a company that operates on razor-thin margins. You didn't invest this money. You incinerated it." "Don't you dare speak to him in that condescending tone," my mother shrieked, suddenly leaping up from the sofa. She rushed over to Spencer, placing a protective, trembling hand on his shoulder. He is under an immense amount of pressure. Being an executive is incredibly stressful. You sit in your safe little consulting office all day. You have absolutely no idea the weight he carries on his shoulders for this family. I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the sheer audacity of her delusion. She was actively defending the man who had just bankrupted their legacy while screaming at the woman they had summoned in the middle of the night to fix it. The weight he carries? I asked, looking directly at my father. Robert, tell me you aren't actually buying this excuse. Arthur Montgomery's venture capital firm is scheduled for a comprehensive audit in exactly 3 weeks. You begged Montgomery for his financial backing last year to keep the shipping fleet afloat. Montgomery is a shark. If his forensic accountants see a $2 million deficit with zero paper trail for this aggressive expansion, he won't just pull his funding. He will dismantle this company and file criminal negligence charges. At the mention of Arthur Montgomery, all the bluster immediately drained from my father's face. He sank heavily into his leather executive chair, suddenly looking every bit of his 62 years. Montgomery was legendary on Wall Street. A ruthless, self-made billionaire who despised incompetence and punished deception with apocalyptic fury. I know, my father muttered, his voice hoarse. He rubbed his temples aggressively. I know what Arthur will do. That is exactly why you're here. And he looked up at me, and in his eyes, I didn't see the love of a father asking his daughter for help. I saw the desperate, calculating gaze of a cornered CEO looking at a disposable asset. You are going to fix this, my father commanded. It wasn't a request. You are the restructuring expert. You know how these corporate audits work. You know the loopholes, the creative accounting, the ways to buy time. You want me to commit federal financial fraud to cover up Spencer's incompetence? I asked, my voice dangerously level. It's not fraud, it's family management, my mother interjected, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. She walked over to me, grabbing my wrists with her cold, manicured hands. The grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by absolute narcissistic panic. Listen to me. We are your blood. You have spent the last 10 years entirely focused on yourself. Your career, your promotions, your fancy apartment in the city. You have completely neglected your family. I tried to pull my wrists away, but her nails dug into my skin. Do you know why Spencer made these mistakes? She continued, tears finally welling up in her eyes, the ultimate weapon of guilt. Because he was lonely at the top. Because his older sister, the brilliant corporate strategist, couldn't be bothered to mentor him. If you had just been around, if you had just guided him, he wouldn't have felt so pressured to prove himself. This is partially your fault. You owe it to him to clean this up. The room went dead silent. The sheer velocity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. She had taken a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar failure executed entirely by a 31-year-old grown man and effortlessly twisted reality to lay the blame squarely at the feet of the daughter they had actively pushed out of the family business 10 years ago. I looked at Spencer. He was watching me over the rim of his crystal glass, a faint, smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew he was untouchable. He knew that no matter what he broke, my parents would always demand that I bleed to pay for it. So, what is the grand plan? I asked, finally yanking my hands free from my mother's grip. I took a step back, putting physical distance between myself and their toxicity. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on his mahogany desk. He had regained his arrogant posture, assuming my question was a sign of compliance. You are going to submit a formal letter of resignation to your consulting firm tomorrow morning, my father dictated, his tone brisk and entirely devoid of empathy. You will take on the title of Director of Crisis Management here at Hayes Logistics, effective immediately. And my compensation? I asked softly. My father scoffed, a short, ugly sound. Compensation? You are stepping in to save your own inheritance. You'll be working pro bono until the Montgomery audit is cleared and the deficit is resolved. Spencer will remain the Vice President of Operations. To the outside world, to Arthur Montgomery, this will look like the Hayes family uniting to streamline the business. You will be the face of the restructuring, and you will ensure that the missing $2 million is categorized as a prolonged structural investment. You want me to quit my high-paying partnership, work for you for free, lie to a federal auditor, and take the absolute legal risk, all while Spencer gets to keep his title and his corner office. Family takes care of family, my mother chimed in, nodding vigorously as if repeating a sacred mantra. It's time you finally stepped up and did your part. 10 years ago, a younger, more fragile version of me would have shattered in this exact room. In my 20s, I would have screamed, cried, and begged for them to see my worth. I would have launched into a desperate defense of my career, pleading for just an ounce of the blind devotion they showered on my brother. I would have let them break my heart all over again. But I was no longer that girl. As I stood in that suffocating, whiskey-soaked study, looking at the three people who shared my DNA but possessed none of my loyalty, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. My professional training as an organizational psychologist kicked in, completely overriding my emotional trauma. I didn't see a father, a mother, and a brother. I saw a failing, toxic corporate structure built on a foundation of massive ego, profound entitlement, and terminal stupidity. They thought they were ordering a loyal servant back into the kitchen to scrub their dirty floors. They thought my silence was the familiar sound of a daughter swallowing her pride and accepting her designated role as the family scapegoat. They were catastrophically mistaken. I looked at my father's arrogant, demanding face. I looked at my mother's fake, manipulative tears. And finally, I looked at Spencer, who was taking another sip of whiskey, completely secure in his golden child armor. They wanted me to manage their crisis. They wanted me to restructure their lives. Fine, I thought, the corners of my lips twitching upward into a microscopic, chilling smile. I'll restructure it until there is absolutely nothing left but ash. All right, I said, my voice smooth, even, and terrifyingly calm. The single word dropped into the tense room like a heavy stone into a still pond. My father exhaled sharply, a sound of profound relief masked by an irritated grunt. Good. Be at the office by 8 a.m. on Monday. I want a full mitigation strategy on my desk by noon, and make sure you look the part. Montgomery's advance team might drop by unannounced. Of course, Robert, I replied politely. I won't let the family down. I turned on my heel and walked out of the study, the heavy oak doors clicking shut softly behind me. As I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase of the estate I was once desperate to escape, I didn't feel the familiar crushing weight of their manipulation. For the first time in my life, I felt the intoxicating, dangerous thrill of absolute control. I wasn't stepping in to save Hayes Logistics. I wasn't stepping in to cover for my brother's crimes. I was stepping in to architect their complete and utter demolition. And I was going to make sure they handed me the sledgehammer themselves. At exactly 7:45 a.m. on Monday, I pushed through the revolving glass doors of Hayes Logistics. The corporate headquarters was a monument to my father's ego. The lobby was expansive, clad in imported Italian marble that echoed sharply with every step I took. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sprawling warehouse complex in the back, while the executive suite sat perched on the top floor like an ivory tower completely disconnected from the blue-collar reality of the supply chain below. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon. I carried a heavy, locked leather briefcase containing my encrypted laptop and forensic accounting software. I didn't look like a prodigal daughter returning to the fold to beg for scraps of affection. I looked like an executioner clocking in for a shift. When I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, the atmosphere was thick with the distinct, suffocating scent of corporate sycophancy. Spencer's corner office was a shrine to his unearned status: glass walls, minimalist furniture, and a massive mahogany desk that was entirely devoid of actual paperwork. My father had temporarily assigned me a cramped, windowless office near the utility closet, a space usually reserved for mid-level data entry clerks. It was a petty, calculated move designed to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. I was there to save them, but I was not to outshine the golden child. I simply smiled, placed my briefcase on the cheap laminate desk, and began setting up my workstation. My first objective was raw data. To dismantle a financial house of cards, you have to find the foundational lie. At 9 a.m., I knocked on the door of the chief financial officer. Clara Bennett was 55 years old, a brilliant, sharply dressed woman who had dedicated the last 22 years of her life to keeping my father's company financially solvent. Her hair was a neat, steely silver, and the deep lines around her eyes spoke of chronic exhaustion and thousands of hours of unpaid overtime. She was the ultimate office mother, the highly competent woman who did all the actual heavy lifting while men like my father and brother took the credit and the bonuses. "Audrey," Clara said, looking up from a dual monitor setup filled with dense spreadsheets. Her voice was polite but guarded. She pushed her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose. "Your father told me you were coming. He said you're here to streamline the restructuring before the Montgomery audit." "That is the official narrative, Clara," I said, stepping into her office and closing the door softly behind me. I took a seat across from her. I had always respected Clara. She was the only person in this building who actually understood how the logistical margins worked. Clara let out a weary sigh, rubbing her temples. Robert sent out a company-wide memo this morning. You're the new director of crisis management. Spencer is still VP. I was instructed to give you read-only access to the Q3 and Q4 operational ledgers. Read-only. My father was already trying to put a leash on the very person he had begged to save him. He wanted me to fix the $2 million hole without actually seeing how deep the rot went. I need full administrative access, Clara, I stated, my tone professional but unwavering. I need the general ledger, the offshore subsidiary accounts, the vendor payment histories, and the executive expense reports for the last 18 months, unredacted. Clara stiffened. She looked nervously toward the glass wall of her office, checking to see if anyone was walking down the corridor. Audrey, you know your father. He specifically requested that I curate the data you receive. If I hand over the master files without his explicit authorization... Clara, I interrupted gently, leaning forward. Arthur Montgomery is not sending a junior accountant to review these books. He's sending a forensic strike team. If there is a $2 million discrepancy, they will find it in 48 hours. When they do, who do you think Robert and Spencer are going to throw under the bus to save themselves? The color drained from Clara's face. She swallowed hard. She knew exactly how the Hayes men operated. She had spent 2 decades watching my father fire competent managers to cover for his own strategic blunders. If the federal authorities got involved, Robert wouldn't hesitate to point the finger at the CFO who had blindly signed off on the outgoing transfers. I am not here to protect Spencer's ego, I told her, my voice dropping to a low, intense register. I am here to find out exactly what happened to that money. You have given your life to this company, Clara. Do not let their arrogance drag you into a federal indictment. For a long, agonizing moment, Clara stared at me. She was weighing 22 years of conditioned loyalty against the terrifying reality of her own legal liability. Finally, she reached into the top drawer of her desk, her hand trembling slightly. She pulled out a secure, encrypted flash drive and slid it across the desk. The decryption key is your mother's maiden name, all lowercase, Clara whispered, refusing to meet my eyes. Everything is in there. May God help us all. Thank you, Clara, I said, slipping the drive into my pocket. I spent the next 14 hours locked in my windowless office. I didn't eat. I barely drank. I let the analytical, forensic part of my brain take total control. When you look at financial data, you aren't just looking at numbers. You are reading a psychological profile. Money leaves a trail of human behavior: greed, panic, desperation, and arrogance. By 11:30 p.m., the glowing screens of my monitors illuminated a truth so grotesquely selfish that it almost made me laugh out loud in the empty, silent building. Spencer had claimed the $2 million was lost to volatile European markets and aggressive expansion strategies. That was a spectacular, laughable lie. There was no European expansion. There was no market volatility. I traced the outgoing wire transfers from the primary corporate operating account. They had been authorized by Spencer and routed into a dummy shell corporation registered in Delaware under the name Apex Horizon Management, LLC. From Delaware, the money was immediately fractured into a dozen smaller transactions to avoid triggering federal reporting thresholds, a classic money laundering technique known as smurfing. The funds were then wired to an offshore account in the Bahamas. I pulled the incorporation documents for Apex Horizon Management. The registered agent was a third-party firm, but the digital footprint of the setup fee led right back to an IP address located at Spencer's luxury downtown penthouse. But where did the money actually go? I dug deeper into the Bahamian routing numbers. The paper trail ended at 2 highly specific destinations. The first was a private, ultra-exclusive marina in Miami, Florida. A payment of $1.2 million had been wired to secure a custom, 85-foot luxury yacht registered under the name Golden Boy. The remaining $800,000 had been systematically bled out in staggered wire transfers over a period of 3 months to a high-stakes, unregulated offshore casino network based in Macau. Spencer wasn't a Wall Street visionary taking calculated risks. He was a degenerate gambler and an arrogant narcissist who had literally stolen his family's operating capital to fund an extravagant playboy lifestyle. But the most sickening discovery wasn't Spencer's thievery. It was my father's complicity. To hide a $2 million gap in the quarterly balance sheets, you need a cover story. I pulled up the internal accounts payable logs. There were exactly 14 invoices generated by Apex Horizon Management, LLC, billing Hayes Logistics for International Supply Chain Risk Assessment Consulting. Every single one of those fake fabricated invoices bore the digital countersigned approval of the Chief Executive Officer, Robert Hayes. My father knew. He knew his golden boy had embezzled millions of dollars from the family business to buy a yacht and cover gambling debts. And instead of holding his son accountable, my father had actively committed corporate wire fraud, falsifying federal tax documents and internal ledgers to protect Spencer from the consequences of his own crimes. They had called me in the middle of the night, weeping about the pressure Spencer was under. My mother had dug her nails into my wrists, accusing me of abandoning my brother. They had demanded I quit my job to save them. And all the while, they knew exactly where the money was. They just needed me, the expendable daughter, the competent workhorse, to legally sanitize their crime before Arthur Montgomery's auditors arrived. They wanted me to build the maze that would hide the monster. I leaned back in my cheap office chair, the harsh blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of their betrayal settled over me like a heavy, freezing blanket. Any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have unconsciously harbored died right there in that windowless room. I carefully exported all the raw data, the fake invoices, and the IP traces onto my own highly encrypted, decentralized cloud server. I built an immutable digital vault that not even a team of federal hackers could breach without my biometrics. Then, I planned my counterattack. If I walked into my father's office the next morning and slapped the evidence on his desk, the confrontation would be explosive. Narcissists, when cornered with undeniable proof of their wrongdoing, do not apologize. They attack. My father would immediately fire me, change the passwords, destroy the internal servers, and likely find a way to frame Clara Bennett for the missing funds. He would burn the building to the ground to protect Spencer. No, a direct confrontation was amateurish. If you want to trap a narcissist, you don't build a cage. You build a stage, hand them a microphone, and let their own insatiable need for applause destroy them. At 10 a.m. the next day, I walked into the grand executive boardroom. My father and Spencer were already seated at the massive mahogany table, drinking premium coffee. Spencer was scrolling mindlessly through his phone, looking entirely unbothered by the impending doom of the Montgomery audit. "Well," my father demanded, glancing at his Rolex, "tell me you found a way to categorize the European losses." I placed my tablet on the table and projected a sleek, beautifully designed PowerPoint presentation onto the large wall monitor. I had spent the early hours of the morning designing a visual masterpiece of absolute fiction. I've spent the last 24 hours analyzing the operational architecture. I began, pitching my voice to sound entirely professional, helpful, and utterly compliant. And frankly, Robert, you were right. Spencer was put in a highly irregular position. Spencer's head snapped up from his phone. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his handsome face. He leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head. "See, Dad? I told you. The metrics are just complex. Audrey gets it." "The problem isn't the expansion strategy itself," I continued smoothly, feeding the beast exactly what it wanted to eat. "The problem is that the current legacy accounting software Hayes Logistics uses is woefully outdated. It failed to properly contextualize the long-term ROI of Spencer's aggressive offshore maneuvers. Arthur Montgomery's auditors are old school. If they look at the raw data in our current system, they will misinterpret the $2 million as a total loss, rather than a delayed yield structural investment." My father narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "So, how do we fix the optics?" "We don't just fix the optics," I said, transitioning to the next slide. The screen illuminated with a sleek, futuristic software dashboard interface. "We upgrade the entire narrative. I have developed a proprietary stopgap software overlay. I call it the Enterprise Resource Planning and Accountability System, ERPAS for short." I walked over to the screen, pointing to the colorful, dynamic graphs I had fabricated. "This system integrates directly with our internal servers," I explained. "It takes the complex, high-level decisions Spencer has been making and automatically translates them into brilliant, Wall Street-friendly analytics. It creates a completely transparent, highly sophisticated paper trail that highlights Spencer's visionary leadership. When Montgomery's team arrives, we don't hide the missing $2 million. We use ERPAS to present it as a masterclass in aggressive venture scaling. Spencer practically salivated. The words visionary leadership and masterclass were pure psychological heroin to a man who had achieved absolutely nothing on his own merit. I love it, Spencer declared, slapping the mahogany table. He looked at my father with bright, greedy eyes. This is exactly what I've been saying. We need to show Montgomery that we are modernizing the firm. This software makes me look like a tech-forward CEO, not just a logistics manager. Are you certain this will satisfy Montgomery's forensic team? My father asked, his voice laced with cautious skepticism. He was a liar, which meant he naturally distrusted everything that sounded too good to be true. It's foolproof, Robert, I assured him, meeting his gaze with unblinking confidence. But for ERPAS to properly generate the recontextualized reports, it requires absolute integration. Spencer, I will need you to run all of your daily executive authorizations, vendor approvals, and wire transfers exclusively through the ERPAS dashboard starting today. It will securely digitize your signature and build the portfolio we need to dazzle the auditors. Done, Spencer agreed instantly, eager to play with his new toy. Install it on my desktop immediately. I want Montgomery to see exactly how I run my division. Excellent, I smiled, a warm, perfectly manufactured expression of sisterly support. I spent the next 2 hours installing the ERPAS software onto Spencer's computer, as well as my father's executive terminal. I gave them a brief tutorial, showing them how the sleek interface transformed their mundane daily tasks into glowing, dynamic charts of operational efficiency. They loved it. They felt powerful. They felt untouchable. What neither my father nor my brilliant golden child brother understood was the fundamental architecture of the software I had just hardwired into the central nervous system of their company. ERPAS wasn't an accounting overlay. It was a highly classified, military-grade keystroke logger and digital forensic net, customized from the tools I used in my corporate restructuring firm to catch embezzling executives. Every time Spencer logged in, the software didn't just record his actions. It silently bypassed the company's internal firewalls and copied every single piece of data on his hard drive. Every deleted email, every hidden chat log with his offshore casino bookies, every receipt for his luxury yacht maintenance. Furthermore, I had programmed a specific subroutine tied to their digital signatures. By actively mandating that Spencer and Robert use ERPAS to approve all daily transactions, they were legally, immutably linking their biometric data and secure IP addresses to the continuing flow of fraudulent invoices. They thought I had built them a digital shield to blind the auditors. In reality, I had just handed them a perfectly tailored, invisible noose. And the beauty of the trap was that they were going to spend the next 3 weeks tightening it around their own necks with absolute, arrogant enthusiasm. As I walked out of Spencer's glass office, leaving him to admire his fabricated visionary graphs on his monitor, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from my mother, Susan. I hope you are actually being useful today. Remember, we are having a large family dinner on Sunday to celebrate Spencer's upcoming presentation with Mr. Montgomery. Aunt Carol and Uncle Ted will be there. Wear something presentable for once, Audrey. Don't embarrass your brother. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer psychological violence of my mother's casual cruelty used to paralyze me. She was already setting the stage for the weekend, preparing to parade her thieving son as a hero while publicly humiliating the daughter who was currently saving them from federal prison. I didn't reply to the text. I just slipped the phone back into my pocket. I will be at dinner. Mother, I thought, walking down the marble corridor back to my windowless closet. I wouldn't miss the show for the world. The Sunday family dinner was a revered institution in the Hayes household. To an outsider, it might have looked like a picturesque gathering of New England elite, crystal wine glasses catching the light of a crystal chandelier, a perfectly roasted prime rib resting on silver platters, and the soft murmur of classical music playing from hidden speakers. But I knew the truth. These dinners were never about family bonding. They were a theatrical stage constructed entirely by my mother, Susan, designed to reinforce the domestic hierarchy. It was a weekly performance where my brother was worshipped, my father was undisputed king, and I was paraded around as the cautionary tale of a woman who chose ambition over warmth. When I arrived at the estate at 6 o'clock sharp, the driveway was already lined with the luxury vehicles of my extended family. Aunt Carol and Uncle Ted, my father's sister and her husband, were inside, along with a few carefully selected corporate executives who my father liked to invite to blur the lines between family loyalty and corporate servitude. Among them was Clara Bennett, our 55-year-old CFO, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a floral blouse, holding a glass of sparkling water near the entryway. I walked in wearing a tailored emerald green silk blouse and dark, wide-leg trousers. Elegant, professional, and entirely impenetrable. "Audrey, darling, you finally made it," my mother called out from the foyer. She glided over, kissing the air inches from my cheek. Her eyes immediately swept up and down my outfit, her lips pursing into a micro-expression of absolute disapproval. "I see you didn't have time to change after your little computer tasks. I suppose that rigid corporate look is just permanently grafted onto you now. I was hoping you'd soften up a bit for family." "Hello, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth and untroubled. I handed my coat to the maid. I dress for the role I'm required to play. "Well, try to smile tonight," she whispered sharply, her fingers digging slightly into my forearm as she leaned in. "Your brother is the guest of honor. He's carrying the weight of the Montgomery audit on his shoulders. Do not bring your usual cold energy to my dining table." I simply detached her fingers from my arm with a polite, firm movement and walked into the grand dining room. Spencer was holding court by the fireplace. He wore a designer cashmere sweater, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist, a watch I now knew was purchased with embezzled corporate funds meant for employee health benefits. He was regaling Uncle Ted with an entirely fabricated tale about his complex negotiations with European supply chain vendors. When Spencer saw me, his chest puffed out slightly. "Audrey, good of you to show up. Did you finish integrating that dashboard for me? I need those analytics looking pristine for Montgomery." He spoke to me with the casual, dismissive tone one might use for an IT support intern. Aunt Carol looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. "It's fully operational, Spencer," I said, offering a warm, perfectly manufactured smile. "Every single one of your decisions is being tracked and logged exactly as you requested. The system is capturing the true essence of your leadership." "Excellent!" Spencer beamed, taking a sip of his bourbon, completely oblivious to the lethal double meaning of my words. We sat down to dinner. The food was exquisite, but the atmosphere was a masterclass in psychological abuse. For the first 45 minutes, my mother orchestrated the conversation with the precision of a military general, ensuring every topic circled back to Spencer's brilliance. "Spencer has simply transformed the operations floor," my mother gushed, passing the roasted potatoes to Uncle Ted. "He has this natural, visionary instinct. Robert always says you can't teach that kind of raw talent in those stuffy Ivy League schools Audrey went to. It has to be in your blood." "It's true," my father chimed in from the head of the table, carving the meat with aggressive, domineering strokes. "Audrey is great with the paperwork. She's a solid administrator. But Spencer has the instinct of a killer. That's what Arthur Montgomery wants to see. A predator." I took a slow sip of my Pinot Noir. I looked across the long table and made brief eye contact with Clara Bennett. The CFO sat quietly at the far end, her plate barely touched. She looked exhausted. She knew that the predator sitting across from her was actually a parasite who had stolen $2 million to buy a yacht, and the visionary expansion was a catastrophic lie. Then came the climax of the evening. As the dessert plates were cleared, my father tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The ringing sound commanded absolute silence. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, preparing to deliver a toast. "Family, friends, colleagues," Robert began, his voice booming with CEO authority. "In 3 weeks, Hayes Logistics will sit down with Arthur Montgomery. It will be the most consequential meeting in the history of this family. And I want to publicly acknowledge the man who is going to lead us into that new era of wealth." He raised his glass toward my brother. "To Spencer, a true leader who isn't afraid to take massive risks to secure our future." The table politely clapped. Spencer looked incredibly smug, raising his own glass in return. But my father wasn't finished. He turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and dripping with a deeply ingrained misogyny he had never bothered to hide. "And I also want to acknowledge Audrey," Robert continued. The room went dead silent. "Audrey stepped away from her consulting job to come back home and help us tidy up the ledgers. You know, Audrey has always been rigid. She's a rule follower. She lacks the creative spark to build an empire, but she is very good at sweeping up the dust." My mother let out a soft, tittering laugh as if my father had just delivered a brilliant joke. "She has always been so obsessed with the fine print," my father said, his voice dripping with condescension, weaponizing my professional expertise to make me sound small and uninspired. "It's why she's 34, unmarried, and married to her spreadsheets. But in times like these, every visionary CEO needs a good housekeeper to organize the files. So, to Audrey, thank you for doing the administrative work so your brother can shine." He raised his glass to me, a backhanded compliment wrapped in a public, humiliating dressing down. It was designed to establish absolute dominance. It was designed to remind everyone at the table and remind me that no matter how successful I was in the real world, in this house, I was nothing but Spencer's maid. 10 years ago, the sheer cruelty of this public humiliation would have broken me. I would have flushed red, tears of profound injustice stinging my eyes. I would have argued, creating a scene which my mother would have immediately used to label me as hysterical and jealous. But tonight, sitting in that lavish dining room funded by stolen money, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, crystalline clarity. I didn't break eye contact with my father. I didn't frown. I didn't shed a single tear. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a tight, defensive smile. It was a genuine, terrifyingly serene smile. I picked up my crystal glass of red wine by the stem. I stood up slowly, my posture flawless, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable power that instantly sucked the air out of the room. "To Spencer's shining moment," I said, my voice echoing with crystal clear precision, completely devoid of anger or hurt. "May Arthur Montgomery see every single thing he has done for this company with absolute, undeniable transparency. Cheers." I took a sip of my wine and sat back down, perfectly composed. The reaction was instantaneous, though invisible to the untrained eye. My father's smug grin faltered slightly. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. They had expected me to bleed. They had expected to feed on my emotional reaction. By denying them my pain, I had completely neutralized their power. I had starved the narcissists. Spencer, too stupid to read the subtle shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, just laughed and drank his bourbon. "Thanks, sis. Make sure those reports are formatted properly by Tuesday." But at the far end of the table, Clara Bennett was staring at me. The veteran CFO's eyes were wide with a profound, quiet awe. She had spent 22 years watching Robert Hayes psychologically batter his subordinates into submission. She had never seen anyone absorb a direct public attack from him and reflect it back with such chilling, elegant indifference. The dinner concluded shortly after. I said my polite goodbyes, thanked my mother for the lovely roast, and drove back to my apartment in the city. I slept like a baby. The next evening, Monday at 7:30 p.m., the corporate offices of Hayes Logistics were nearly empty. I was sitting in my windowless closet monitoring the ERPAS software. Spencer had spent the entire day routing his golf club membership fees and a $15,000 charge for client entertainment in Vegas through the new system, immutably linking his digital signature to the embezzlement under the guise of the new, transparent dashboard. A soft, hesitant knock on my doorframe broke my concentration. I looked up. Clara Bennett stood there, clutching a heavy leather tote bag to her chest. She looked left and right down the dimly lit hallway before stepping into my office and quietly pushing the door shut until it clicked. "Clara," I said, sitting back in my chair, "you're working late." "I could say the same for you, Audrey," she replied softly. She walked over to the cheap laminate desk and stood there for a long moment, staring at the glowing screens of my monitors. She looked incredibly tired, bearing the invisible scars of a woman who had spent her entire career being undervalued and overworked by arrogant men. "I saw what happened at the dinner last night," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what your father did to you, what he said." "It was nothing I haven't heard 1,000 times before," I replied smoothly. "No," Clara shook her head, her eyes locking onto mine with an intense, burning clarity. "I saw how you reacted. You didn't break. You looked at him like he was already a ghost." I remained silent, letting her speak. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. This morning, Robert called me into his office. He told me that when Arthur Montgomery's auditors arrive, if they ask any questions about the missing $2 million, I am to tell them that the funds were temporarily misallocated due to a clerical error in the accounting department. My department. A surge of cold fury rippled through my chest. My father was already laying the groundwork to frame Clara. He was preparing to sacrifice a 55-year-old woman, destroying her career, her pension, and potentially sending her to federal prison just to protect his thief of a son. He asked you to take the fall for wire fraud, I stated, stripping away the corporate euphemisms. He didn't ask, Clara corrected bitterly. He ordered me. He reminded me that I am a 55-year-old woman in a ruthless corporate market. If he fires me for incompetence, I will lose my pension and I will never get hired as a CFO anywhere else. He is holding my entire life hostage to save Spencer. Clara reached into her heavy leather tote bag. Her hands were shaking, but her jaw was set with a fierce, absolute determination. 22 years ago, I built the accounting infrastructure for this company from scratch, Clara whispered, tears of profound rage finally pooling in her eyes. I missed my daughter's school plays. I worked weekends. I bled for Hayes Logistics. I will not let a spoiled, arrogant boy who uses company funds to buy a yacht send me to a federal penitentiary. She pulled her hand out of the bag and placed a sleek, heavy titanium hard drive squarely on my desk. What is this, Clara? I asked, though my heart was already pounding with the realization of what she had just done. The flash drive I gave you on Friday contained the official ledgers, the ones Robert and Spencer forced me to alter over the last 18 months, Clara explained, her voice gaining strength with every word. But I am an accountant, Audrey. I deal in facts, and I know never to trust a man who asks you to erase a number. She tapped the titanium drive with her index finger. This is the shadow ledger, Clara revealed. It contains every single original, unfalsified bank statement, every raw wire transfer receipt, and every deleted internal email from Spencer demanding that I route money to his offshore shell companies. It proves that Robert was explicitly aware of the embezzlement, and it proves that I formally protested the transactions in writing before my father threatened to terminate my pension. I stared at the titanium drive. It wasn't just evidence. It was a loaded gun handed to me by the very woman my father thought he could easily crush. Why are you giving this to me, Clara? I asked, looking up into her eyes. I am Robert's daughter. I am Spencer's sister. By all conventional logic, you should assume I will destroy this drive to protect my family. Clara offered a sad, knowing smile. A smile shared between women who understand what it means to be the collateral damage of male ego. Because last night, at that dinner table, I watched a woman who has entirely severed the emotional umbilical cord to her abusers, Clara said firmly. You aren't here to save them, Audrey. I've been watching you set up this ERPAS system. I know what a keystroke logger looks like. You are here to bury them, and I want to help you dig the grave. I slowly reached out and placed my hand over the titanium drive. The cold metal felt like absolute justice against my palm. My father thought he was the ultimate puppet master. He thought his manipulative wife, his stolen money, and his boardroom bullying made him an untouchable king. But he had made the most fatal mistake a narcissist can make. He had severely underestimated the silent, unseen rage of the women he treated like garbage. Clara, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register, Arthur Montgomery isn't just sending auditors in 3 weeks. He is coming himself to finalize the restructuring deal. Clara's eyes widened slightly. I am going to build an execution block in the main boardroom, I promised her, slipping the titanium drive into my locked briefcase. And when the blade falls, I will personally ensure that you walk out of this building completely untouched, with your pension fully vested and a severance package that will make Robert weep. Clara let out a long, shaky breath as if a decade of tension was finally leaving her body. What do you need me to do? Nothing, I smiled. Keep your head down, agree with everything Robert says. Let them feel incredibly comfortable, Clara, because a predator is easiest to trap when it firmly believes it is the one doing the hunting. The Shadow Alliance was forged in that windowless room. The clock was ticking down to the Montgomery audit, and my family, blinded by their own towering hubris, had absolutely no idea they were already walking as dead men. The countdown to Arthur Montgomery's arrival had officially entered its final week, and the atmosphere inside Hayes Logistics was humming with a manic, delusional energy. Narcissists have a fascinating relationship with reality. When faced with the undeniable consequences of their actions, they don't reflect or repent. Instead, they construct a parallel universe where they are the ultimate victims, the misunderstood geniuses, or the untouchable kings. Over the next few days, I watched my family build a magnificent, invisible castle out of thin air, completely unaware that it was resting on a foundation of digital dynamite. It began on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my windowless office running a silent background diagnostic on the ERPAS keystroke logger when my father's executive assistant called. Robert wanted to see me in his suite, immediately. When I walked in, my father was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, a thick, bound legal document resting perfectly in the center of his leather blotter. He wasn't glaring at me today. Instead, he wore a paternal, magnanimous smile, a smile that instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the smile he used right before he closed a predatory deal. "Audrey, sit down," Robert said, gesturing to the plush leather chair opposite his desk. "I want to talk about your role here. You've been working tirelessly to prepare the ERPAS integration for Montgomery. I have to admit, I'm impressed by your dedication to the family." "I am simply executing the restructuring as requested, Robert," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly neutral. I didn't take the bait of his rare compliment. Compliments from my father were never gifts. They were down payments on future favors. "Yes, well, the optics are crucial right now," Robert continued, leaning back and steepling his fingers. "Arthur Montgomery is an old-school shark. If he walks in here next Wednesday and sees that the person managing the transition is just acting as an informal consultant, he won't respect the process. He needs to see skin in the game. He needs to see a unified, legally bound executive front." He slid the thick legal document across the desk toward me. "I had our corporate attorneys draft this up yesterday," Robert explained smoothly. "It officially appoints you as the Chief Restructuring Officer of Hayes Logistics. It gives you full, unimpeded executive authority over the departmental budgets for the duration of the Montgomery audit. You wanted power to fix this? Here it is." I looked down at the document. The title page read, "Executive Fiduciary Assumption and Restructuring Authorization." My heart didn't flutter. My hands didn't shake. I simply opened the cover and began scanning the dense, heavily formatted legal jargon. To a layman, it looked like a standard executive employment contract. But I was a senior partner at a restructuring firm. I spent 80 hours a week dissecting predatory corporate law. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the poison pill buried in Section 4, Paragraph C. The clause explicitly stated that by accepting the role of Chief Restructuring Officer, I was assuming total retroactive fiduciary responsibility for the company's operating capital for the previous fiscal year. It completely absolved the CEO and the VP of operations of any unforeseen financial irregularities discovered during the restructuring process, placing the legal and financial liability entirely on the shoulders of the CRO. Me. My father hadn't just built a glass ceiling for me. He had built a trapdoor leading straight to a federal penitentiary. He knew Clara Bennett might break under federal pressure. He knew she had the original ledgers. But Clara was just an employee. I was family. In my father's twisted, narcissistic calculus, blood loyalty meant I would never testify against him or Spencer. By forcing me to sign this document, he was legally turning me into the ultimate human shield. If Arthur Montgomery found the missing $2 million, the paper trail established by this contract would point directly to Audrey Hayes as the rogue executive who had mismanaged the funds. He was actively, deliberately planning to send his own daughter to prison to protect the son who had used the money to buy a yacht. The sheer, breathtaking evil of the document sitting in front of me was almost beautiful in its mathematical cruelty. "It's a standard liability transfer, Audrey," Robert said, noting my silent reading. His voice held a slight edge of impatience, daring me to question his authority. "If you are going to present the ERPAS system to Montgomery, you need the legal authority to back it up. Spencer has already signed his portion of the operational handover. We just need your signature on the last page." I looked up from the contract. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the document in his face or ask him how he could possibly do this to his own flesh and blood. I already knew the answer. To him, I wasn't flesh and blood. I was an asset, and assets are meant to be liquidated when the company is in danger. "This is incredibly comprehensive, Robert," I said, my voice dripping with manufactured awe. "It certainly gives me the leverage I need to handle Montgomery's auditors, but as you know, my consulting firm has strict non-compete clauses. I just need to run this past my personal counsel this weekend to ensure it doesn't violate my external partnership agreements. I can have it signed and returned to you first thing Monday morning." Robert frowned, his jaw tightening. A narcissist hates delay. It gives their victims time to think. It's a formality, Audrey. We don't have time for outside lawyers to drag their feet. I assure you, it's just a box I have to check. I smiled softly, adopting the subservient, rule-following persona he despised but relied upon. I wouldn't want a technicality from my Manhattan firm to invalidate my authority here during the audit. I'll have it on your desk at 8 a.m. on Monday, along with the standard NDA and confidentiality packets for the PAS integration. Robert studied me for a long moment. He saw a 34-year-old spinster obsessed with red tape. He didn't see a threat. Fine, he grunted, waving a dismissive hand. First thing Monday. Do not complicate this, Audrey. I wouldn't dream of it, I promised. I left the office carrying the weapon he had just handed me. That Saturday, I didn't rest. I sat in the hyper-modern conference room of my Manhattan law firm with my personal corporate attorney, a ruthless litigator named Sarah who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers. I showed her the contract my father had drafted. Sarah read Section 4, Paragraph C, and let out a low, incredulous whistle. Audrey, this isn't a contract. This is a suicide vest. If you sign this, you are legally confessing to every single instance of wire fraud your brother committed. Why would your father hand you this? Because he thinks I'm too desperate for his approval to read the fine print, I replied coldly, sipping my espresso. And because he thinks I'm too stupid to rewrite it. So we declined the contract, Sarah stated, reaching for her red pen. No, I stopped her hand. We sign it, but we bury a localized addendum in the confidentiality packet I'm returning to him on Monday, a severability and compliance contingency clause. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a predatory grin slowly spreading across her face. You want to weaponize the fiduciary duty. Exactly, I nodded. Draft an addendum that explicitly states my assumption of fiduciary responsibility is entirely contingent upon the CEO and the VP of operations operating in strict, unbroken compliance with all federal KYC, Know Your Customer, and AML, anti-money laundering regulations for the prior 24 months. If any prior or active executive fraud, embezzlement, or falsification of records is discovered, my fiduciary liability is not only voided ab initio, but the entire legal liability, including massive punitive damages, reverts instantaneously to the primary signatories, Robert and Spencer. It's a dead man's switch, Sarah whispered, her fingers flying across her keyboard to draft the clause. If they are hiding stolen money, which we know they are, signing this addendum legally binds them to their own fraud. But Audrey, you have to get your father to sign the addendum without reading it. If he spots this clause, he'll know you know. He won't read it, I said with absolute chilling certainty. He's an arrogant man who believes he's the smartest person in the room. He views compliance paperwork as beneath him. I will bury the addendum on page 42 of the PAS software licensing agreement. He'll sign it just to get me to shut up. On Monday morning at exactly 8 a.m., I walked into my father's office. I dropped a massive 2-inch thick stack of dense legal documents onto his desk. On the very top was the fiduciary assumption contract he had given me, bearing my crisp, legally binding signature. Signed as promised, I said briskly. And underneath are the standard software licensing agreements, NDAs, and data compliance forms required for the ERPAS system to legally interface with Hayes Logistics servers. I need your signature on the flag pages to bring the system fully online for Montgomery. Robert saw his signed fiduciary assumption contract on top. The relief in his eyes was palpable. He had his scapegoat. He was safe. Driven by the euphoric high of believing he had successfully manipulated me, Robert didn't even glance at the dense text of the software agreements beneath it. He simply grabbed his expensive Mont Blanc pen and flipped to the yellow sticky tabs I had carefully placed throughout the stack. Sign, flip, sign, flip, sign. He signed page 42 without a second thought. He legally cemented the severability and compliance contingency clause. He had just signed his own financial and legal death warrant. Excellent work, Audrey, Robert praised, handing the stack back to me. Now, make sure Spencer's presentation is flawless. Montgomery doesn't tolerate hesitation. With Robert's legal trap completely neutralized and reversed, I turned my attention to the true weak link in the family, my brother's boundless, fragile ego. By Wednesday, Spencer was practically living inside the fake ERPAS dashboard I had built for him. The software was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Every time Spencer approved a mundane supply order or signed off on a fleet maintenance log, the screen would flash with dynamic green arrows projecting massive, entirely fictional ROI, return on investment metrics. It fed his narcissistic delusion that he was a business prodigy. I walked into his glass-walled office holding a tablet, closing the door behind me. Spencer was leaning back in his chair, his feet propped up on his mahogany desk, admiring a line graph that falsely claimed his European strategy was projecting a 300% growth yield for the next quarter. "The numbers look incredible, don't they?" I said, standing beside his desk. "I'm telling you, Audrey, this system finally captures my vision," Spencer bragged, tapping his temple. "Dad has always been too conservative. He runs this logistics firm like a 1990s trucking company. I'm trying to turn it into a global tech-forward supply chain. Montgomery is going to lose his mind when he sees this growth projection." "He is," I agreed, my voice smooth as silk. "In fact, looking at these metrics, I'm actually a little concerned that we are playing it too safe." Spencer lowered his feet from the desk, his brow furrowing. "Too safe? What do you mean? I thought the whole point was to cover the $2 million. "Covering the $2 million is defensive thinking, Spencer," I said, leaning in slightly, lowering my voice to adopt a conspiratorial tone. I was speaking directly to his greed. "Arthur Montgomery is a billionaire venture capitalist. He doesn't respect defensive CEOs who just try to balance the books. He respects aggressive predators who double down on success." I swiped a finger across my tablet, throwing a new, spectacular graph onto his monitor. "If your current offshore strategy is yielding these kinds of projected returns despite the initial $2 million cash drag," I lied effortlessly, "imagine what you could do if you had real capital. Why are we going into this meeting begging Montgomery to excuse a $2 million deficit? You should be going into this meeting demanding an additional $10 million in new venture funding to aggressively scale your offshore model." Spencer stared at the screen. His pupils literally dilated. The thought of having $10 million of fresh, untraceable capital dumped into his lap triggered an intoxicating rush of pure dopamine. $10 million, Spencer breathed, his mind immediately calculating the size of the upgrades he could make to his yacht, the high roller suites he could command in Macau. "But Robert will never go for it," I sighed, pulling back slightly to trigger his contrarian defiance. "He's too terrified of Montgomery. He just wants to survive the audit. He doesn't have the stomach for high-level venture scaling." "Dad is a dinosaur," Spencer scoffed, his arrogance reaching critical mass. He stood up, pacing the length of his office, completely consumed by the illusion I had painted for him. "He built a solid foundation, sure, but he doesn't know how to play in the big leagues. If I go in there and ask for $10 million, backing it up with these ERPAS analytics, Montgomery will see that I'm the true future of this company. He'll sideline Dad and put me in the driver's seat." "It's a bold move, Spencer," I whispered, the ultimate supportive sister. "But to pull it off, you need to show Montgomery exactly how aggressive your current offshore architecture is. The ERPAS system needs all the raw data to build the pitch. You need to upload everything." "Everything?" "All of it," I confirmed. "I need you to manually upload the unredacted wire transfer logs, the routing numbers for Apex Horizon Management, the vendor invoices. The system will encrypt them and convert them into an anonymized, aggressive expansion portfolio. Montgomery won't see the specific account numbers, but he will see the massive volume and velocity of your capital movement. It will prove to him that you are operating at the level of a Wall Street hedge fund manager." Spencer didn't hesitate for a single second. The promise of $10 million had completely blinded him to basic operational security. "I'll do it right now," Spencer said eagerly, sitting back down at his terminal. He unlocked his secure private drive, the drive containing the undeniable, unfalsified evidence of his embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud, and began dragging and dropping the files directly into the ERPAS upload portal. I stood behind him, watching the progress bar fill up with absolute chilling satisfaction. He thought he was feeding the system the raw materials to build his empire. He didn't know that the ERPAS system was actively transmitting every single one of those files directly to my decentralized, encrypted server, cross-referencing them with the shadow ledger Clara Bennett had provided me. He was literally handing me the murder weapon, covered in his own fingerprints, and asking me to polish it for him. By Friday evening, the trap was fully loaded, locked, and primed for detonation. My mother, Susan, decided to host a final victory dinner at the estate to celebrate what she perceived as her family's ultimate triumph. They were so confident in their manipulation, so secure in their belief that they had successfully enslaved me to fix their problems, that the mood bordered on euphoric. "I just know Arthur Montgomery is going to be blown away by you, Spencer," my mother gushed over a plate of seared scallops, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "And Audrey, I have to admit, you've been surprisingly helpful this week. It's nice to see you finally acting like a part of this family." "I am entirely committed to ensuring this family gets exactly what it deserves, Mother," I replied, raising my glass of sparkling water. My father was equally arrogant. He sat at the head of the table, swirling his expensive wine, completely unaware that the fiduciary contract he was relying on to save his life had been legally weaponized against him. "We walk into that boardroom on Wednesday, we project strength, we show him the ERPAS dashboard, and we walk out with a clean bill of health," Robert declared. "Actually, Dad," Spencer interrupted, a slick, condescending smile on his face. "I'm pivoting the strategy. I'm not just going to show him the dashboard. I'm using the analytics to pitch him for an additional $10 million in Series B funding." My father paused, his wine glass hovering in midair. $10 million? "Spencer, that wasn't the plan. We just need him to overlook the $2 million gap. Don't push our luck with Arthur Montgomery." "You play not to lose, Dad. I play to win," Spencer shot back, his inflated ego completely overriding his father's authority. "Audrey and I ran the numbers. The offshore expansion model is highly scalable. Montgomery wants aggressive growth. I'm going to give it to him. It's time Hayes Logistics stopped acting like a regional delivery service." For a moment, I saw a flash of genuine panic in my father's eyes. He knew his son was an idiot. He knew the offshore expansion was a lie. But because Spencer had invoked my name, citing the numbers I had supposedly verified, Robert's internal alarms were muffled. He looked at me for confirmation. I simply offered a calm, reassuring nod. "The projections Spencer has generated in the system are incredibly compelling, Robert. It's a flawless presentation." My father exhaled, his ego soothing his anxiety. He couldn't publicly shoot down his golden boy in front of my mother, not when the numbers supposedly backed him up. "Fine, but you let me do the talking if Montgomery starts asking hard questions." "Don't worry, Dad," Spencer smirked, cutting into his steak. "I've got everything under control." I sat quietly at the table, listening to the clinking of expensive silverware and the sound of my family suffocating on their own hubris. They were so busy admiring the crowns they had placed on their own heads that they couldn't feel the sharp, cold steel of the guillotine blade resting gently against the back of their necks. The execution was scheduled for Wednesday at 10 a.m., and I had already written the eulogy. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp, unforgiving clarity of an executioner's blade. At exactly 9:45 a.m., 3 black, armored SUVs pulled into the circular driveway of the Hayes Logistics corporate headquarters. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my father's executive suite, watching the doors open. Arthur Montgomery stepped out of the lead vehicle. At 65, he was a monolithic figure on Wall Street. He didn't wear flashy designer labels or heavy gold watches like my brother. He wore a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray, bespoke suit that spoke of quiet, generational wealth. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, and his eyes, even from 3 stories up, looked like they could cut through solid steel. He was flanked by 4 men carrying heavy, locked briefcases, his forensic strike team. Behind me, my father, Robert, was nervously adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a framed logistical map. Despite his usual arrogant bluster, sweat was beginning to bead at his temples. Deep down, the coward in him knew that Montgomery wasn't a man you could bully or charm. Spencer, however, was completely immune to the gravity of the situation. He was practically vibrating with misplaced adrenaline, reviewing his tablet, already spending the $10 million he thought he was about to secure. "Showtime," Spencer smirked, checking his reflection in his phone screen. "Let's go get Montgomery's money." We descended to the grand boardroom on the executive floor. The room was a massive expanse of mahogany, glass, and leather, designed to intimidate. Clara Bennett, our 55-year-old CFO, was already seated near the far end of the table. She wore a modest gray blazer, her hands neatly folded over a legal pad. When I walked in, we didn't exchange a single glance. Our shadow alliance was perfectly, silently calibrated. At 10 a.m. sharp, the double doors swung open. Arthur Montgomery walked in, his presence immediately sucking the oxygen out of the room. His team fanned out behind him, taking their seats with synchronized, military-like precision. They didn't offer small talk. They didn't smile. "Arthur, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to our headquarters," my father boomed, stepping forward with his hand outstretched, projecting the false confidence of an apex predator. Montgomery looked at my father's hand for a fraction of a second before briefly, firmly shaking it. "Robert, let's dispense with the pleasantries. My time is extremely valuable. I am here to review the quarterly deficit and assess the viability of my continued investment in this firm." He sat down at the center of the table, placing his hands flat on the mahogany. "Impress me." My father swallowed hard, taking his seat. He looked at my brother, giving him a tight nod. Spencer stood up, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. He walked to the head of the table, tapping his tablet to wake the massive LED presentation screen mounted on the wall. "Mr. Montgomery, thank you for coming," Spencer began, his voice dripping with the slick, hollow charisma of a tech bro pitching a startup. "I know your auditors are here to look at a $2 million variance in our Q3 operating capital, but I want to recontextualize that number for you today. At Hayes Logistics, we don't view that as a deficit. We view it as the seed capital for an aggressive offshore structural expansion." Montgomery's expression remained entirely unreadable. He simply stared at Spencer, waiting. "The logistics industry is evolving," Spencer continued, pacing slightly, gesturing with his hands. He was hitting all the buzzwords I had fed him. We needed to move quickly to secure international vendor routing. I utilized a proprietary data overlay system, our new Enterprise Resource Planning and Accountability System, or ERPAS, to aggressively scale our offshore footprint. The initial $2 million friction was necessary to establish the architecture. Spencer paused, offering Montgomery a confident, predatory grin. "In fact, Arthur, I'm not here to apologize for that $2 million. I'm here to ask you for an additional $10 million in Series B funding. Because once you see the volume and velocity of our offshore capital movement, you will realize that Hayes Logistics is ready to dominate the European market." One of Montgomery's forensic accountants, a sharp-looking man in glasses, looked up from his notepad. "You have the raw analytics to support this velocity, Mr. Hayes?" "I have exactly what you need to see," Spencer boasted proudly. "Everything is completely transparent. I've uploaded the unredacted wire logs, the vendor invoices, and the offshore routing metrics directly into the ERPAS dashboard. Allow me to show you the future of this company." Spencer turned to the screen. He raised his presentation remote. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his father. He was entirely consumed by the blinding light of his own towering ego. He clicked the button. The screen did not display the sleek, dynamic graphs with green arrows pointing upward. It did not show projected ROI or European supply chain maps. Instead, the massive LED monitor went completely, terrifyingly black for 2 full seconds. Then, a stark, high-resolution document flashed onto the screen. Across the top, in bold, undeniable red letters, read the header, "Forensic Audit and Embezzlement Disclosure." Underneath the header, the screen was split into 3 distinct damming panels. The first panel displayed a crystal-clear image of an 85-foot luxury yacht named Golden Boy, moored in a private Miami marina. Directly beneath the photo was the unredacted wire transfer receipt for $1.2 million, originating from the primary Hayes Logistics operating account, routed through the Delaware Shell Company, and landing directly in the marina's escrow account. The second panel displayed the official ledger of an unregulated offshore casino in Macau. It detailed $800,000 in staggering high-stakes losses, time-stamped over the last 3 months. But it was the third panel that served as the final, lethal blow. It displayed a massive high-definition scan of a fraudulent invoice from Apex Horizon Management, LLC, for international supply chain consulting. Right next to it was a digital biometric verification log. It showed that the invoice had been electronically approved and countersigned by an IP address located in this very building. The digital signature on the screen, blown up for everyone to see, belonged to Robert Hayes. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, suffocating, and heavy as lead. Spencer stood frozen, his arms still raised, the presentation remote hovering uselessly in his hand. His brain completely short-circuited. He stared at the picture of his secret yacht, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it almost looked like physical pain. What is this?" Spencer stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whisper. "Audrey, The system is glitching. The graphs, where are the graphs? My father, Robert, reacted exactly as a cornered narcissist always does. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening, ghostly white. He looked at the screen, saw his own digital signature legally tying him to wire fraud, and he instantly realized that the illusion was completely obliterated. He didn't leap up to protect his son. He didn't take responsibility. He immediately looked for a body to throw onto the tracks to stop the oncoming train. Robert violently pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping harshly against the floor. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at me. "Arthur, this is a setup!" My father roared, his voice tearing through the silent room in a desperate, ugly panic. He scrambled to open the leather portfolio in front of him, his hands trembling violently. "This is a fabricated sabotage. My daughter, Audrey, she is deeply unwell. She is a bitter, vindictive woman who has always been jealous of her brother." Montgomery didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked onto my father with an expression of profound, chilling disgust. "She engineered this software to frame us," Robert continued to shout, pulling out a thick stack of stapled papers, the fiduciary assumption contract he had forced me to sign. He practically threw it across the table toward Montgomery. "Look at this! She is the chief restructuring officer. She has total fiduciary responsibility for the operating capital. I legally transferred the authority to her on Monday. If money is missing, if there is fraud on that screen, she is the one who did it. She embezzled the funds and manipulated the IP addresses to point at us." It was the most breathtaking display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. In a room full of Wall Street titans, my father was actively, frantically trying to send his own flesh and blood to federal prison to save his own skin. I remained perfectly seated in my chair, my hands calmly resting on the mahogany table. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I simply let him scream, letting the entire room witness the pathetic, rotting core of the Hayes family patriarch. Arthur Montgomery did not pick up the contract my father threw at him. Instead, the billionaire slowly stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with a deliberate, meticulous movement. The sheer power radiating from him forced my father to instantly shut his mouth, panting heavily. "Robert," Montgomery said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute submission of everyone in the room. "Do not insult my intelligence by attempting to sacrifice your daughter to cover your own breathtaking incompetence." My father froze, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocating fish. Montgomery reached into his own locked briefcase. He pulled out a sleek titanium flash drive and placed it gently on the table. It was the exact duplicate of the shadow ledger Clara Bennett had given me. "I did not come here today to review a $2 million deficit," Montgomery stated, his eyes cutting between my terrified father and my paralyzed brother. "I already know exactly where the money went. I received the raw, unredacted wire logs, the casino markers, and the marina receipts 48 hours ago, delivered directly to my private server." Spencer let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, finally lowering his arm. He looked at me, the realization crashing down on him like a physical blow. You sent it to him?" I offered my brother a cold, microscopic smile. "I told you, Spencer. I needed you to upload all the raw data so the system could build the perfect portfolio. You literally handed me your own confession." "You treacherous little bitch," my father snarled, taking an aggressive, violent step toward me. Before he could close the distance, two of Montgomery's men stood up instantly, blocking Robert's path with an intimidating physical presence that dared him to take another step. Robert recoiled, shrinking back into his chair. "She is the CRO," Robert pleaded desperately, pointing at the contract lying on the table, clutching to his last remaining lifeline. "Arthur, you have to look at the contract. She legally assumed the fiduciary liability. The paper trail stops with her. I have her signature." "Oh, I've seen your contract, Robert," Montgomery replied, his tone laced with razor-sharp mockery. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a single piece of paper, marked with a yellow sticky tab. "Page 42. In fact, I found this particular clause utterly fascinating." My father stared at the piece of paper in Montgomery's hand. His eyes darted to the yellow tab. A wave of profound absolute horror washed over his features as he finally recognized the document. It was the ERPAS licensing agreement he had blindly signed on Monday morning. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored navy suit. I walked to the head of the table, standing right next to the massive screen displaying their crimes. "Let me help you with the fine print, Robert," I said, my voice ringing with unshakable crystalline authority, "because I know how much you hate administrative work." I looked directly into my father's terrified, bloodshot eyes. "You forced me to sign a contract assuming all legal liability for your son's embezzlement. You wanted to build a trap door for me," I stated, stripping away the corporate facade entirely. "But you were so arrogant, so high on the thrill of your own manipulation, that you didn't read the licensing addendum I slipped into the compliance packet." I pointed to the paper in Montgomery's hand. "That addendum contains a severability and compliance contingency clause," I explained, ensuring every single person in the room understood the sheer magnitude of his failure. "It explicitly states that my fiduciary assumption is entirely voided if it is discovered that the CEO and VP were actively engaged in wire fraud, money laundering, or the falsification of federal tax records, which, as the screen behind me proves, you absolutely were." My father gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. He was physically shaking. "But the addendum doesn't just void my liability, Robert," I continued, dropping my voice to a lethal, icy whisper. "It contains a reversion clause. By signing page 42, you legally bound yourself and Spencer to full, unmitigated financial and criminal liability for the missing funds, plus massive punitive damages to the primary investor. You didn't trap me, Robert. You signed your own confession." "No!" Spencer suddenly wailed, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch that bounced off the glass walls. "No, Dad, tell them she's lying. Tell them you didn't sign it. I don't want to go to jail. Dad, do something." Spencer, the golden boy, the visionary leader, collapsed back into his chair and buried his face in his hands, openly sobbing. He sounded exactly like a terrified child. All of his designer clothes and expensive watches couldn't hide the fact that he was nothing but a fragile, incompetent parasite. My father didn't comfort him. Robert stared at the floor, breathing heavily, completely dismantled. The empire he had built on a foundation of misogyny, arrogance, and lies was currently burning to the ground around him, and he had actively struck the match. Arthur Montgomery looked at the two men with absolute contempt. "The gross negligence displayed in this room is unprecedented," Montgomery announced, his voice echoing with finality. "Hayes Logistics is in direct violation of the covenants of my investment. You have committed massive corporate fraud, and you have attempted to suborn perjury by framing an innocent executive to cover your tracks." Montgomery turned to his lead forensic accountant. "Execute the hostile protocol." The accountant opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal filings, dropping them onto the table. "As of 10 a.m. this morning, my firm has formally initiated a hostile takeover of Hayes Logistics," Montgomery declared, delivering the death blow. "Due to your breach of contract and the activation of the liability addendum Robert so graciously signed, I am calling in the entirety of your corporate debt immediately. You are entirely insolvent. Your equity is wiped out. You no longer own this company. I do." "You can't do this," Robert gasped, clutching his chest. "I built this company from nothing. It carries my name." "Your name is now a liability," Montgomery countered coldly, "and my team isn't the only one reviewing these documents today." Right on cue, Montgomery gave a subtle nod to one of his men standing by the door. The man reached out and pulled the heavy mahogany double doors wide open. Standing in the marble hallway, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with those 3 unmistakable yellow letters emblazoned across their backs, were 6 agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop drastically. Clara Bennett let out a long, quiet exhale at the end of the table, her hands trembling as she watched the ultimate justice unfold. The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing woman with a badge clipped to her belt, stepped into the boardroom. She didn't look at the sleek furniture or the terrified executives. She looked directly at my father and brother. "Robert Hayes, Spencer Hayes," the agent announced, her voice a sharp, uncompromising bark of authority. "You are both under arrest for multiple violations of federal law, including international wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. Stand up and place your hands behind your backs." "No! Please!" Spencer shrieked, scrambling backward in his chair until he hit the glass wall. "I'll give the yacht back. Just let me call my mother. Dad, call a lawyer." 2 federal agents surged forward, grabbing Spencer by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. They didn't care about his custom suit or his tears. The harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs locking tightly around my brother's wrists echoed through the silent boardroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My father didn't fight. The arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life bullying his subordinates and demanding absolute worship from his family was completely broken. His eyes were vacant, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. As the federal agent yanked his arms behind his back and secured the handcuffs, Robert finally looked up at me. There was no rage left in his eyes. There was only a profound, horrifying comprehension. He finally realized that the daughter he had treated like a disposable housekeeper was the architect of his total destruction. "Why?" Robert whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "We are your family. Why didn't you just help us?" I looked at the man who had tried to send me to federal prison just 48 hours ago. I felt absolutely no pity. "I did help you, Robert," I replied, my tone devoid of any emotion. "You asked me to streamline the restructuring and bring transparency to your operations. I simply delivered exactly what you ordered." The federal agents spun them around and marched them toward the door. They were paraded out of the executive suite, dragged past the glass-walled offices where their employees stood watching in stunned, absolute silence. The golden boy and the tyrant king, reduced to common criminals in steel chains, walking the perp walk through the empire they had destroyed. As the heavy boardroom doors swung shut behind them, severing my toxic family from my life forever, the room fell completely silent. Arthur Montgomery stood at the head of the table. He looked at the massive LED screen, which was still displaying the unredacted proof of their crimes. Then he turned his gaze to me. The billionaire reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He slid it across the mahogany table toward me. "True integrity is a rare commodity in my world, Audrey," Montgomery said, his voice dropping the aggressive edge he had used with my father. It was replaced by a tone of profound professional respect. "You possess the courage to stand in the blinding light of truth, even when it meant dismantling your own blood. You saved my firm from a $10 million mistake today, and you protected an innocent woman in the process." Montgomery gestured slightly toward Clara Bennett, who was wiping a tear of profound relief from her cheek. "When the dust settles on this federal indictment and Hayes Logistics is officially liquidated under my portfolio," Montgomery continued, looking me dead in the eye, "I am going to need a new chief operating officer for my Manhattan Acquisitions Division. I don't want a yes man. I want the architect who built this trap." I picked up the black card. The embossed gold lettering felt heavy with the promise of a brilliant, completely independent future. "I'll have my legal team review your offer, Mr. Montgomery," I smiled, a genuine, powerful expression of absolute victory. "But I have a feeling we are going to do extraordinary business together. The collapse of a narcissistic empire does not happen in slow motion. It is not a graceful, tragic descent. When the foundational lies are finally pulled away, the destruction is instantaneous, violent, and absolute." By 4 p.m. that afternoon, the news of the FBI raid at Hayes Logistics had already leaked to the major financial networks. The chyron scrolling across the bottom of the screens in Manhattan high-rises read CEO and VP of Hayes Logistics arrested in multi-million-dollar offshore wire fraud skeleton. The federal government, especially when prodded by a billionaire investor like Arthur Montgomery, moves with terrifying efficiency. Civil asset forfeiture warrants had been signed by a federal magistrate before my brother even had his fingerprints taken at the holding facility. I drove out to the Connecticut estate one last time as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows over the manicured lawns. I didn't go to gloat. I went because, as a psychologist, I needed to close the file on the longest, most exhausting case study of my life. When I pulled through the wrought iron gates, the flashing red and blue lights of local law enforcement were already painting the grand brick facade. Federal agents were actively taping seizure notices to the massive oak front doors. Inside the grand foyer, the scene was one of pure, unadulterated, aristocratic panic. My mother, Susan, was standing at the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase. She was surrounded by 3 massive, expensive Louis Vuitton suitcases, frantically trying to stuff velvet jewelry boxes and designer silk scarves into them before the agents could catalog the assets. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a disheveled mess. The heavy, diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist, purchased with the blood and sweat of underpaid warehouse workers, trembled violently. When she heard the click of my heels against the imported Italian marble, she whipped her head around. For a fraction of a second, her face contorted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. She knew exactly what I had done. Her husband's frantic phone call from the back of a federal transport vehicle had shattered her delusion. But Susan was a master manipulator, a woman who had spent 60 years weaponizing her emotions to control every room she entered. The hatred vanished, instantly replaced by a brilliant, terrifying performance of shattered maternal grief. Susan collapsed to her knees on the marble floor, her expensive silk blouse pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands and let out a wretched, theatrical sob that echoed off the high ceilings. "Audrey," she wailed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch designed to elicit maximum guilt. "Audrey, what have you done? Your father, your brother, they took them. They put my baby boy in steel chains." She crawled forward, reaching out with desperate manicured fingers, trying to grab the hem of my tailored slacks. I took a smooth, deliberate step backward. Her hands grasped nothing but empty air. "You destroyed us," Susan sobbed, looking up at me with wide, tear-streaked eyes. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? We are your family. I gave you life. I carried you in my womb. I sacrificed my youth to raise you, and you handed your own brother over to the FBI. You are a monster." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had systematically dismantled my self-esteem for 3 decades. I didn't feel a shred of the old panic. I didn't feel the desperate childhood urge to apologize and beg for her love. I just looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a researcher observing a predictable, parasitic organism. "You didn't sacrifice your youth to raise me, Susan," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through her hysterical performance like a scalpel. "You hired nannies to raise me so you could spend your afternoons at the country club, and you certainly didn't sacrifice for Spencer. You worshipped him because his unearned arrogance was a perfect reflection of your own." "He made a mistake," my mother shrieked, slamming her fists against the marble floor. "He is young. The pressure of the business was too much for him. We could have fixed the money quietly. We could have paid it back. But you were so consumed by your petty, pathetic jealousy that you burned our entire lives to the ground." "Jealousy?" I repeated, letting out a soft, chilling laugh that made her physically flinch. "I was never jealous of Spencer. I pitied him because you and Robert crippled him. You taught him that he was a god, but you never bothered to teach him how to be a man. You funded his offshore gambling and his luxury yacht with stolen money, and you thought you could use me as the legal human shield when the bill came due. We are your parents," she screamed, abandoning the weeping victim persona and reverting to the vicious tyrant she truly was. "You owe us your absolute loyalty." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Loyalty is a two-way street, Susan. You demanded my loyalty to cover up a felony, but where was your loyalty when I actually needed a mother?" Susan froze, her eyes darting nervously. Narcissists hate being confronted with specific history. It ruins their carefully curated narrative of perfection. "Let's talk about my master's graduation," I continued, forcing her to look at me. "I was 24 years old. I graduated at the top of my class from Columbia. I stood in the rain for 2 hours waiting for you and Robert to show up, but you didn't." My mother swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. "You didn't come because Spencer had just barely managed to graduate from his state college with a C- average, and he demanded a celebration trip to Miami," I recalled, the memory no longer carrying pain, only absolute clarity. "You stopped by my tiny apartment the night before you flew out. You didn't hug me. You didn't say you were proud. You simply handed me something and told me to take myself out to a nice dinner so I wouldn't bother you while you were celebrating your golden boy." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers closed around a crisp piece of paper. I pulled it out and let it flutter down from my hand. It was a single, pristine $100 bill. I had kept it for exactly 10 years. I had kept it as a reminder of exactly how much my family thought I was worth. The bill landed softly on the cold marble floor, resting right next to my mother's trembling knee. "Consider the $2 million fully audited, Susan," I told her, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "And consider my debt to this family paid in full. Buy yourself a nice dinner tonight, because tomorrow the federal government is changing the locks on this house, and you won't have a kitchen." I turned my back on her. "Audrey, come back here," my mother shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as the reality of her impending homelessness finally crashed down on her. "You cannot leave me here. I have no money. The accounts are frozen. Audrey." I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I walked out the grand oak doors, past the federal agents and stepped into the cool evening air. The agonizing screams of the woman who had emotionally terrorized me for 34 years faded into the background, drowned out by the sound of my own steady, powerful heartbeat. I was completely, utterly free. The following 6 months moved with the swift, uncompromising brutality of the American justice system. The media spectacle surrounding the Hayes Logistics embezzlement was catastrophic. The trial was practically non-existent, given the sheer volume of immutable digital evidence I had provided to Arthur Montgomery and the FBI. Spencer's highly paid defense attorneys attempted to negotiate a plea, but the federal prosecutors were merciless. During the final sentencing hearing, the golden boy of the Hayes family stood before a federal judge wearing a coarse, scratchy orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was a greasy mess, and his arrogant swagger had entirely evaporated. The judge handed down a crushing sentence of 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, citing his complete lack of remorse and the aggressive nature of the wire fraud. My father, Robert, the Tyrant King, didn't fare much better. The undeniable proof that he had attempted to suborn perjury and legally frame his own daughter added massive obstruction charges to his indictment. He was sentenced to 8 years. The man who had spent his life dictating the markets and bullying women now spent his days sweeping the concrete floors of a cell block, stripped of every ounce of power he once held. The collateral damage, as dictated by civil asset forfeiture laws, completely obliterated my mother's reality. The sprawling Connecticut estate was seized and auctioned off. Her luxury vehicles, her offshore trust funds, and her country club memberships were instantly liquidated to pay back the defrauded investors. Susan Hayes, the woman who had obsessed over designer labels and high society status, was violently expelled from the elite circles she worshipped. Her wealthy friends severed all contact, treating her like a radioactive pariah. Penniless and disgraced, she was forced to rent a cramped, damp apartment in a high-crime neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The woman who used to mock my boring corporate suits was now working a grueling minimum wage job as a cashier at a discount retail store. She spent her days scanning barcodes under harsh fluorescent lights, her soft hands calloused, facing the blistering contempt of a society that recognized her face from the nightly news. I did not visit them in prison. I did not reply to the desperate begging letters my mother sent from her dingy apartment. I had excised the toxic infection from my existence with absolute surgical precision, and I never looked back. While they suffocated in the dark, miserable pit they had dug for themselves, I was busy ascending to the absolute pinnacle of my career. I didn't just accept Arthur Montgomery's offer to become his chief operating officer. I negotiated. I used the immense leverage and respect I had earned during the Hayes Logistics takeover to secure a massive venture capital investment from him. The gloomy, windowless closet my father had banished me to was a distant, laughable memory. I currently stood in the center of a massive sunlit corner office on the top floor of a pristine glass skyscraper in Manhattan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed, commanding view of the city skyline. I wore an impeccably tailored, cream-colored suit that projected ultimate authority and quiet, unshakable power. A heavy, frosted glass plaque sat proudly on my polished mahogany desk, bearing the name of the new empire I had built. Strategic restructuring. A soft knock broke the quiet hum of the city below. The heavy glass door swung open, and Clara Bennett walked in. At 56, Clara looked 10 years younger than she had at my father's company. She was wearing a stunning, sharp maroon blazer. The heavy, exhausted bags under her eyes were completely gone, replaced by a fierce, confident spark. When Hayes Logistics went under, I kept my promise. Clara walked away completely legally untouched, and the very next day I made her the co-founder and chief financial officer of Lumina. The Montgomery Quarterly reports just came in, Audrey, Clara smiled, handing me a sleek tablet. Our restructuring model for his tech acquisitions has increased his operational yield by 22%. He's thrilled. He's bringing us 3 more corporate accounts next month. Excellent work, Clara, I smiled, taking the tablet. Let's schedule a board meeting for Thursday to review the expansion. And Clara, make sure you take Friday off. You've earned a long weekend. I think I'll do exactly that, Clara beamed, turning to head back to her own luxurious corner office. As the door clicked shut, I walked over to the massive window, looking out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of New York City. My biological family had spent decades trying to erase my worth. They were terrified of my intellect, disgusted by my independence, and enraged by my refusal to worship at the altar of their golden child. They thought they could break my spirit by keeping me in the shadows, treating me like a disposable asset to be used and discarded. They forgot one crucial, undeniable fact. When you banish a woman to the shadows and force her to survive in the dark, you don't break her. You teach her how to see everything they are trying to hide. You teach her how to become the architect of her own survival. They tried to bury me, but they didn't realize I was the seed that would grow into the tree that shattered their foundation. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you have ever been the scapegoat in a toxic family dynamic, if you have ever had your achievements minimized, your boundaries crossed, and your hard work exploited by people who demanded your loyalty but offered you nothing but manipulation in return, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Shared DNA does not obligate you to endure abuse. You do not owe your success, your peace, or your protection to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. The greatest, most satisfying revenge you can ever achieve against a narcissist isn't screaming at them. It isn't trying to force them to see your worth. It is quietly, methodically building an empire of your own, entirely out of their reach, and letting their own unearned arrogance be the author of their destruction. If this story of ultimate justice and taking back your power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that sometimes stepping out of the family shadow is the only way to find your own blinding light. Drop a comment below and tell me, how did you finally set your boundaries and walk away from the toxicity in your life? I read every single one, and I can't wait to hear your stories of resilience. Until next time, protect your peace, know your worth, and never, ever let anyone else hold the pen to your life story.